Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the connective webinar on the Neal Awards, What You Need to Know Now. My name is Allison Bostrom, and I'm the Neal Awards Program Manager. Just to let you all know, we will be recording the webinar for your reference. I'm going to pass it over to our host, the Neal Awards Committee Chair, David Longobardi.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be with all of you today to give you a close-up, might even say an insider's view of the Jesse Neal Awards, Connective's prestigious annual program honoring excellence in business journalism. My name is David Longobardi. I'm chairman of the Neal Awards Committee, as Allison said, and I'll be your host for this webinar, which features a panel of my esteemed and wonderful and thoughtful colleagues, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. I've been in business journalism and B2B media for pretty much my whole career. I was most recently the Chief Content Officer of Source Media, which publishes many brands in financial services and technology. And before that, I was editor-in-chief of the company's flagship American Banker. I am joined today, let me just move up to that page, by three great colleagues, including Bill McDowell, who is Vice President Editorial Director at MTG Media Group, John McManus, who is Vice President Editorial Director Residential at Hanley, and Erika Taylor, Director of Content for Professional Remodeler at SGC Horizon. These three people will be shepherding you through much of the program. And like myself, they are pretty passionate about the Neal Awards. I think, you know, to just kick things off, I think we all talk a lot about on the committee about why the Neal Awards matter. And, you know, we have a pretty strong point of view on that. First of all, we think that this is a very challenging time for the media business and the journalism business. In fact, you know, change is everywhere and it is very intense. And while all of us embrace change, we also, I think, and we think in common with most of the folks on this call, embrace a set of core beliefs about what makes for high quality business journalism. And it's that value system that's embodied in the Neals. Even though, you know, footnote, the Neals also embrace change, and we'll get to some of that in the program. The second thing is perhaps a little bit on the defensive side, but I see it more as making a proactive argument. B2B content sometimes gets a bad rap. Most prominently that we tend to be boosters of the markets we cover. And of course, we all know better, and we think at our best, certainly, our work strongly refutes that. You know, and so the mission of the Neals in many ways is to identify and to honor the kind of critical coverage, the kind of serious content that challenges our professional audiences and pushes them to do better. And that's certainly one of the core purposes of the Neals. Finally, winning validation from the Neals, whether as a finalist or an actual winner, has tangible value too. I guess spiritual tangible value. This value accrues to your management and colleagues in other parts of your company, and I guess this is the tangible part, the people who work every day to convert our work to dollars and who are looking for proof points. So awards like the Neals function in that way. And this is especially true as more of us are turning to subscription revenues for growth, where our actual content is sold because it is actually valuable. But more important, we believe very strongly, and we know from personal experience, that Neal Awards motivate and recognize individuals. And for editorial leaders, that's hugely important. And for the individual performers themselves, it's a true credential that will follow you throughout your career. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We've divided the program into 3 components. All in, we think it should take somewhere around 45 to 50 minutes, depending on how many questions we get along the way. We will be pausing throughout for questions, but I think the way things are structured, most of those questions are going to come through the webinar dashboard. So please use that if you have questions, and we all will see them and draw them to one another's attention and jump in and answer them as they go. So I didn't dwell on the timeline. That is in there too. Are we going to distribute? I think we're going to distribute the deck, and certainly the recording will be available to everybody. And these dates are on the website. But the early nominations are, happening now. So this is a very relevant and very immediate opportunity to focus that work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the discussion of categories. I'm going to leave it right there for John McManus to jump in. John.
Great. Thank you, David. And good afternoon and good morning to folks. Thanks for being with us. We're going to, as David said, we have this gift that we get to wake up in the morning and do the work that we do, that it matters, and it means something to people to be able to interact with what we do as work and to be smarter and have success and help them grow. So it's a gift to be able to do that. And from a high level, what you do is work on the content and work on making it great. And then there's this process, which is the Neal Awards process. It's not our full-time jobs, and so there are kind of challenges that we encounter with respect to engaging with this process. And at a high level, what we're going to do for a couple of minutes is to talk with you about the fact that there's language, there's terminology, there's terms in the process of entering Neal Awards that can sometimes be ambiguous or not clear. And so hopefully by looking at them for a few minutes with you today, we can draw attention to some of those areas where some of us have confusion, some of us have kind of snags in being able to kind of do this process effectively. So we'll address that for a few minutes. And when I think about the categories, you see them all here. There are a reduced number of them. It allows us to focus more narrowly on where the opportunities are. And to some extent, the intention here is for these categories to match up to where we all spend the better part of our time. As you can see, more and more of the categories that we are focused on are kind of channel neutral. They're agnostic with respect to print or digital. They're trying to allow for excellence to show in all of the different formats that we work in. So to some extent, I think of this process of engaging with Neals and all the different categories as kind of a category management process for editors to look at. And what I mean by that is that it really is a matching kind of exercise of seeing where your strengths, where you've been able to put a lot of focus on meeting needs of your audiences and users to work among your team members. So that's kind of obvious in some ways, but it's really important to kind of look carefully at the description of the categories, of the entries, make sure that you review them, see whether there's any updates and refreshes to the language around those categories, because this team and the team that David leads is tweaking constantly the language to try to, again, have course corrections to make sure it's matching up to our work. So go through them, understand them. If you don't have clarity on any part of this, there's going to be a list of resources, and David and Erika and Bill and myself will be available for any questions you might have on any of the categories. So look at where your best work is, and I think that that's a good place to start, and then see how it kind of fits with a category. And hopefully what you expend in terms of time and energy and money on these award processes, you can get the most out of them. So we're just going to take a look at one of the areas where there's frequently confusion, and that area of what's technical content versus instructional content is an area where we frequently have either a misunderstanding or an overlap of the intentions of the people that enter. Just so that we can kind of simplify it, they're both forms of service journalism. They both help our users or audiences do their jobs better. But when you think of one versus another, technical content is about helping decision making, and instructional content is about helping people figure out a way to do something. So the technical content would unpack complex systems and help people to understand the subject matter expertise to make decisions so that the use of that information can kind of improve outcomes. The instructional content is really basically teaching people to get through a workflow and do a process so that they can have a product or platform that is going to be what they want. So we can maybe take a second there and pause and see if there's any questions regarding the language or the distinction between those two areas, and then I'll go on.
So, John, there's one question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This question is, my publication serves a highly specialized niche. How could an editor from another industry evaluate the quality of my work if it's in such a specialized space and that evaluator is not?
That's a great question. I think that all of us are subject matter experts in some areas. They're particular disciplines, and they're not across. We're not all Renaissance people. So I think that it's just going to come down to the clarity and the kind of helpfulness of the information, the way it's structured, the access points that you get into it, and some of those are kind of principles of how to make information clear and a series of actions clear. So I think there's an ability for us as practitioners in all of our respective disciplines to understand how to stage and cadence and set up a workflow for a clear process to take place, even if we don't have that direct subject matter expertise. I'd welcome other viewpoints on that as well.
Hi, this is Bill. Yeah, I'll just jump on that and echo what you said there. I mean, it's really not uncommon to look at and evaluate something in a field that you are certainly not an expert in. But I think the commonalities of what makes good B2B journalism are pretty true regardless of what the subject matter is. Is the piece that you're evaluating richly sourced? Is the writing or the presentation of the material crisp and clear? Is the presentation designed so that whoever the target reader is, he or she can get in and be able to absorb and synthesize that information quickly and easily? Is it efficient? So I think all of those things are pretty universal, regardless of whether you're talking about construction techniques or financial models or even medical topics.
I agree with that real strongly, and just to say that the great work in whatever context for whatever audience makes a case for itself, and I think that strong framework, even if you move outside the realm of technical or educational content, is present in that work, and we've seen it many times where a topic that is completely outside a realm that we would normally explore is brought to life for us in a way that could only be compelling for even a specialized audience.
Thank you. Now, if there are no other questions about the distinction, difference, similarities between technical and instructional content, we'll move on. And please feel free to either put a chat in or raise your hand for further questions. So this next area, we might call it the art of the Neal. We sort of have introduced areas where it's been overlooked for some years, the contribution in storytelling and access into engagement with our content, the work that our partners are doing on the graphic design, the design, the architecture of the information. They're really, really important part that, especially as we move more into digital, that art directors and design directors are playing in our field. So this, in some respects, comes into more of a discussion that I'll take up next, which is where there is an opportunity around categories that fewer entries are coming in, and I think that might be a way to consider that there's more opportunity for you, especially if you have great work here. But the art categories, you can see that we have two areas here. The two are actually, the first one is divided into two actual categories. One is on covers, which would cover for print, and then the article is either print or digital. So that heading splits into two categories where there are entries welcome in both the cover and the design, access, and storytelling of a cover, and then the ways that an article can be laid out in print or digital. The second heading refers to an overall series of works digitally that represent a thematic or a cohesive approach to something that art and design can solve that words cannot. So it's definitely an area that you can consider because there's so much work happening at small, medium, and large organizations and title sizes and team sizes that it can be excellent at any of those levels. So we wanted to encourage that by reminding you of these categories. So as we flow through, as I mentioned, there is a great concentration of entries in just a few areas of the Neal Awards. You can see here that 30% of 2019's Neal entries submitted by almost 50 different companies competed in just three categories. Now we have revenue separation in some of these categories, but if you're going for best single article, best subject-related package, or best single issue of a tabloid newspaper magazine, you're going to cover 30% of all of the entries. And then you add in the fourth biggest category, which is the best series, and you've got almost 40% of all of the entries. Now, you might imagine that if most people are entering in those categories, that you might have an opportunity to look at some of the work that you're doing and see that looking at some of the areas where the concentration of entries is not as great might be a greater opportunity for you. Now, we have a picture here of a baseball player who played in the 1890s. It's postseason now, so we might think about his philosophy, which is that he was known for being able to put the ball where people weren't. So this is really what we're thinking about as you look at these other categories. Range of work by a single author. This is the largest of this group of them, but you can see in each successive area here that the level of interest and engagement with each of the categories might give you and your team a really good opportunity to shine, and that's why we're kind of drawing attention to them. So we'll just take a minute here and pause and see if there's anyone that wants to bring up some discussion point around this area. And if not, that what we'll do is to kick it back over to David, and he'll talk with you about another area for you to consider at this point.
Thanks, John. So, in addition to the Neal Award, the primary content categories for the Neals that John described, there are also a number of wonderful leadership awards that Connective and the Neal Committee bestow annually. And I'll just very quickly walk through those. The first three, the G.D. Crane Award, the Timothy White Award, and the Marianne Decker Matera Award, are all named and honored through the deliberations of the same committee that decides on the Neal honorees. The third one, the McAllister Fellowships, are done by a larger group of leaders at Connective, and with a very, very close consultation with the McAllister family, which endowed that award. But those are there are two awards there in terms of the fellowships, one for an editor and one for a business person, and they're really great. You get to go to Northwestern and work with a class of journalism students, and there's a modest honorarium associated with it, and it's a great honor. The Crane Award is a broad award for people who have demonstrated commitment to editorial excellence in business media. The Timothy White Award focuses on leadership in the face of challenges, and in my experience, those are people who have sustained a lot of pressure from the industries they cover, who have truly gone against the grain in terms of challenging the industries they cover, and in some cases, going out and doing the kind of even risky on the scene sort of reporting that you might assume is more typical in general journalism. The Matera Award is the most recent entry to this group, and it's all about mentorship. And we've been very delighted to be handing out this award, I think, for maybe 4 years, 5 years. And it opens up a whole other side of the value system that we bring to our work, which is really that idea of cultivating talent and nurturing talent. And the awards themselves do that, but so do we as individuals. And the love for this work that we pass on and the value system that we talked about at the outset of this discussion are very present in that award. Just pause to see if anybody wants to add anything on that. There's a question which we will get to later on a category actually, we can pause there. And any questions on the Leadership Awards, please fire away. There's a question that asks, does winning in one category preclude winning in other categories? And I'm assuming that question means for the same exact entry. And someone help me with that.
I can. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Erika.
I was just going to say, for the most part, no. There are certain categories where you can't enter the same thing in different categories. And it's spelled out pretty clearly on the entry form. An example of times when you can is when you get into something like best range of work and best series. Well, you could certainly pull part of a series out from an individual author and put that up for part of best range of work from that same author, because otherwise it would be too restrictive for people to win. And so I would say that I believe humbly that the entry form does a great job at outlining where and when and what the limitations are in terms of entering the same piece of content in different categories. And there are times you can do it and times that you can't. Does anyone else have anything to add?
So the net answer is no, but there are exceptions based on really more like kind of Venn diagram overlaps for specific types of content into different categories or people. But generally speaking, if it's the identical entry, it can't be entered somewhere else. Is that fair, Erika?
Yes. And it's the entry form, I think, does a pretty good job if you look at it at where and when it's permissible and when it's not.
Great. On the Mentor Award, what is the criteria for determining that? Do you talk to mentees, peers, et cetera? Yes, there's and I'll get some help from my colleagues on this one as well. There's an entry essay and information that we ask to be submitted. I believe there are references and recommendations that are included in that entry. I think that's correct. Someone?
I believe so. I'm not completely sure off the top of my head, but that certainly sounds right.
I'm going to hunt it up while you guys go on.
Should we move to, the interim, should we move to the next section? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about submitting your entries. I'm trying to get this slide to advance here without much luck. There it goes. So the entry submission, the entry and the submission process are of equal importance in terms of increasing your chances of winning. As a judge, I've seen some great entries that are badly submitted. I've seen great entries submitted in categories that they might have done better had they been in a different category. And I've seen entries that are not as strong advance forward, perhaps not all the way to winner, but certainly advance past the first screening process because of the way that they are packaged and submitted. So the way that you think about, the way that you strategize how you're going to enter and what categories is so important. And the other thing about it, I think, that's often overlooked is that I think it can be a lot of fun. I think that if you bring other people in and you make it something that you can do with a team, and if you don't have a big team, challenge yourself to be better and think about what a pleasure it is to win, what a wonderful feeling to get the accolades from your peers in the industry, in the journalism industry. And I find it to be very, very rewarding if you have perhaps a younger or less experienced team member and you are entering their work. It's like you're giving them a vote of confidence in their abilities and their abilities to grow and in the work that they've done. And I find that to be it's a wonderful morale builder. And it's almost like it flows back and forth. As you build other people's morale, your own morale builds as well. So on our team, we have a great time coming up with what we're going to enter and how we're going to do it. Another thing that's really important to think about when thinking about the entries is planning it beforehand. So one thing I don't suggest is, excuse me, I'm just going to grab a little bit of water. One thing that I don't suggest is looking at the end of the year at everything you've done over the course of the year, picking out your best content and entering it. Because without that pre-planning, it's more difficult to craft a winning entry. Typically what seems to work is getting out in front of it and thinking, okay, are we going to have a series? Are we going to put that series up for a Neal? When are we going to run it? What is that going to look like? Do we have opportunities for cross-platform types of content? Can we add a podcast? What can we do to really make this stand out? Another thing to think about, as John mentioned earlier, is targeting the best categories. So which categories might have less entries in them, and can you recraft or rethink about the entry that you're planning so that it fits into another category? I think many media brands have had success doing that. And the building of excitement is really important, especially when you're planning something like a series or a best single issue, something that, or best podcast, something that is not just sort of a one-shot deal, but something that takes a long time, involves a lot of different moving parts, involves designers. You can make it an event. You can work with the designer that you have and tell them, that you're putting the content up for this award, and how can they really put their all into it. And sort of creating it takes a team to win a Neal, and creating that team spirit is a lot of fun. So some of the things that tend to do better in terms of scoring is content that goes across platforms. And when I say across platforms, I don't just mean like, oh, you have it in print and now, hey, it's up on the website too. But think a little bit bigger. Is there a podcast that you can add to it? Is there an interview that was done for this piece that's just really wonderful? There was some really wonderful quotes. Perhaps the source spoke in a very emphatic tone that was interesting, or perhaps there were quotes that you were unable to fit into the final piece. Maybe you can cut it up and put it online as some kind of an audio component. Thinking creatively in that way, and it doesn't have to cost a ton of money, and it doesn't even have to take a huge amount of time. It just has to take a little ingenuity and commitment to the ideals behind it, that you can end up with a really nice package. And also, when you're thinking about the piece beforehand, when you're planning it, I think that from the judges' perspective, the judges are reading an enormous amount of content. They're looking at a lot of content, and that examining of content is compressed into a short period of time. So in order to make your entry stand out, think in terms of entry points. Think in terms of getting that extra source in there, or that slightly unusual source, that expert that maybe was maybe a little harder to get the person, but it was so worth it because they brought all this expertise. Sort of the details, adding that extra layer of context, that extra layer of analysis, that little sidebar that just adds that spice, that extra seasoning that I think really makes something stand out. It's just something where people read it and look at it and they're just like, wow, you want sort of the wow. So I think that it is so important and so much fun to do this. And let's see. I'm trying to get to the next slide here. So in thinking about and now that you've crafted this beautiful entry and it's really where you want it to be editorially, how do you write it up? How do you present it to the judges? So some of the summary on there, I've seen them as a judge where they just look like somebody literally just cut and pasted some content off of their website that described their brand. And I think that that's important and certainly has its place, but also remember that you're speaking to people who might not have any experience in your industry at all. So make sure that you provide context in the entry description of who your audience is and what the purpose of this particular piece is and what the effect was that this piece of content had. And really don't be afraid to provide some detail and some richness of explanation. And don't be afraid to write the entry form. Think of it as a piece of writing rather than a piece of, rather than you're filling out a form, you're actually writing something that you would bring the same attention to as a piece of content that you were producing, because it does make a difference, and they absolutely do get read by the judges. A lot of the time, judges will read those entry descriptions and put the piece that they're judging against the entry description. And by that I mean, if it says the purpose of this brand is X, Y, and Z, they will then look at that piece of content and see if they feel that it fulfills that purpose. It's very, very, very important to read and reread and read again the instructions on the individual category rules, because sometimes they're very detailed. I think there was a question earlier that was excellent about, can you enter something in more than one category? And some of the category rules are complex. They have to be. It's a complex system. And so it's very important. It's a terrible thing when someone is disqualified because their entry did not conform to that particular category. And it's something that nobody wants. Certainly, us least of all. We consistently run into where we can't access the piece of content because there's a problem with the website password not working, or for whatever reason the entry was taken off of the site, and that's also hard. And finally, when you are entering and you're entering multiple pieces of content, please try to be really clear. And by multiple pieces of content, I mean it's one entry, but perhaps it has a number of different components. Please try really hard to be clear about what those components are, where they are, and how many of them there are, because it does get perhaps maybe what's clear in the head of the person who's writing up the entry might be less clear in the mind of the judge who's reading it, because we're not familiar necessarily with the brand. I'd also like to add that the entries, I think the write-ups should probably be checked over by somebody else. So one person is writing up the entry form and somebody else is reading it to make sure that all the points are addressed and that the actual writing in that entry is lively and compelling and informative and rich and detailed. So does anybody else have anything to add to that?
There's a question or two. I think one of them you touched on already. Someone who says they've heard that the entry form doesn't matter and that the judges just look at the work itself. And I think you already answered that pretty clearly, Erika, which is, no, we do. We look at the entries. We really do.
Yes, I say nay to that. We look very carefully at the entry forms.
And then there was a question on print issue, magazine issue entries. Is it better to submit the actual hard copy of the physical magazine that's come off the press, I think is the point of the question, or to go digital on that?
Do you want to answer that, or would you like me to answer that?
I think I'd be interested in hearing a variety of points of view on it, but why don't you go ahead first, Erika?
So I think it's that the digital, I think that digital entries are preferred. They're and there are some cases where that's an exception. There are some categories where, like best single issue, where a hard copy is really irreplaceable in terms of reading it. But I think, we live in a digital world and so much of content is consumed digitally now that my recommendation would be to, in most cases, to submit your entries digitally.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that exactly the way you put it, which is that 99% of the time, make it digital and make it clear where we go to get it. The only exception is best single issue, and that's not necessary, but it's still a very convenient and appropriate way to assess a complete issue. So in that case, we don't have a problem with hard copy and treat it at least equally.
Okay, so it looks like there's another question here about a suggested word count for the entry description. Can it be too long or too short? And when you are entering, you'll see that there's a maximum character count, which is, I believe it's 1,500 characters, which I think is, depending on how long your words are, the word count on that can vary. So it's not a haiku, but it's definitely not a book either. You do need to be careful with making the ideas, expressing them in a way that is very streamlined.
Yeah, I think what I've found is and this again echoes what Erika said. This is a pitch, right? And I think a trap that I've fallen into in years past, members of my team have, is you try to boil the ocean in that entry summary. And I think it's better to have an impactful paragraph that tells you why this matters and why you think it's great work in sort of real terms. If it had a post-publication impact, if it cost a sidebar in a congressional committee or cost someone to change their approach to something, this is a place where you can include that. If you want to even amplify what's let's imagine it's a feature story and there's a nut graph that's talking about why it matters and why it's so important that what you're writing about, what you've reported on, you can pick up on that in the entry summary and sort of hammer it home. It gives you an extra chance to sell the value and the importance and the impact of what you've done.
That's great. Yes, well said. I'm wondering if we should move on to the next area.
Yes. Allison, you've included some examples in the next two, which maybe folks can consume at their leisure. Is that right?
And then, this is examples of. Is this a Grand Neal winner?
These are two examples of entry write-ups that were submitted with for two recent Grand Neal winners, and so clearly on some level they worked. They went through several layers to the Grand Neal. 4 layers of judging and review, and I think they stand on the merits.
So I realize we're getting a little push for time, but I do think it's worthwhile to read the first sentence of the background statement. It's such a great example of how this can be really work when it's done. Over dinner at an automotive news event in 2017, A famously reticent auto dealer became enthusiastic and poignant when the subject turned to how his team pulled through the Great Recession. It almost reads like the lead of a story. It just makes you interested. It pulls you in. It makes you realize how important this topic is. And that's just like a textbook example of how to do this, in my opinion.
Beautiful.
Okay, so next is going to be Bill McDowell, who is going to talk about judging.
All right. Thanks, Erika. Okay, so everybody has taken time now to study up on all the different categories and select what your best work is that might be competitive in those categories. And you have thoughtfully and comprehensively worked with your team to put together compelling entries. What happens now? All right, you've hit submit. You've done everything that you can. What happens to my entry now? Okay, so once the entry has gone into the system, it effectively goes through 3 rounds, 3 phases of judging. Okay, and each one of these will have multiple people looking at your work. In an ideal world, by the time a winner is announced, it has gone through a minimum of 9 sets of eyes. 9 of your peers have looked at it. Round 1 is effectively a screening process that's going to identify potential finalists. Then it goes to a second phase that's really, at that point, identifying who the finalists are. And round 1 is one that we'll talk about this in a minute, but at round 1 we really are encouraging folks to get involved. It's a great way to learn about the process, to see a lot of great work, and to better understand really, it becomes very apparent very quickly what a solid entry looks like when you get involved at this level. Round 2 tends to be among members of the editorial committee for Connective, and another pitch to consider getting involved at that level. There's a lot of great networking to be had. And then once those finalists are determined, it goes to the finals where the winners are selected, and then from those winners, the Grand Meal is selected. So we're going to talk a little bit about the role of the jury and kind of how all this works. So at all 3 phases, entries are scored on a 1 to 10 scale. Okay, and so a perfect score on any Neal entry is a 30, and that is extremely rare. Okay, the 1 to 10 scale is broken up into 3 different categories. And all of this is explained in much more detail on the entry materials. But effectively, it's significance to the field, and this is an area where filling out that statement that Erika was just talking about is so critically important, because this is where the judges are effectively determining what's the importance of this entry. Why does your target audience care about this topic, and why is this topic important enough for an entire issue of your magazine to be devoted to it, or for a 3-part series to be devoted to it. So this is where you're able to really connect the dots between the work and the audience. The second category is journalistic enterprise, and again, this is where you can really help your case by fleshing out that entry statement. If this is a piece of work that a single editor or staff writer did that involved 30-plus interviews across 6 time zones, this is where you're going to want to make note of that. We've had some entries in the past where, particularly in some of the digital categories, where the same person did the reporting, did the production work, did the editing, did the posting, and in one case even, the person even kind of crafted the background music that was being used in the podcast. So the amount of enterprise that goes into both the reporting and the production process is something that we look at very carefully. And then finally, the craftsmanship. How well was this story executed? Regardless of the particular medium in which it's being presented, is the writing sharp? Is it clearly presented? Is it visually arresting? This is where the overall presentation and the graphics package, is it clean? Is it easy to get in and out? Are those entry points there that Erika referred to? So each one of these is evaluated on a 1 to 10 scale, and then beyond the numeric ranking of the finalists, at the very end, the judging teams are very conscientious about discussing and debating the merits of the entries to ensure that, particularly because some of these, the scoring can be quite close, and you may have as little as a point or even a half a point separating the finalists. And so there's a vigorous discussion to talk about the relative merits of all the entries to ensure that there is a consensus on the winners. One thing to sort of be aware of is that, and I think that this is actually a good thing, the judges that are all involved all come from different types of media brands and have different biases in terms of the things that really resonate with them. Some judges come from a hard news background and are really looking at entries from that perspective. Others from much more of a traditional service journalism perspective. Some of them may have some domain or subject matter expertise that they can bring some insight into whether the entry is particularly innovative or illuminating. So that consensus phase is important to really make sure that ultimately the winner is something that all of us feel is an example of the best work possible in that particular category. It's important to know that at all three phases, we're very careful to make sure that judges are not assigned to judge the work of their competitors, and if for some reason an entry slips through that preliminary assignment process, we make sure that they individually recuse themselves to avoid any conflicts of interest. And as we've said now multiple times, that audience and niche statement is really critical to inform fair and thorough judging. There are multiple entries that everybody is looking at, and anything that's able to sort of flag and help prioritize the work is hugely valuable. So who are these judges? So as I said before, the round one screeners come from all across SIA and connective member companies. We do really prefer and encourage that it's supervisor or management level editors. We're always looking for ways to get folks a little bit at an earlier point in their career involved, but it helps a lot to have judges who, as a part of their regular work, review and edit the work of others, as part of their regular routine, to make sure that all these entries are getting the level of scrutiny that they deserve. And then some of those new graphics categories that John was talking about do call for folks on your graphics team, your art directors and designers, to get involved as judges. We want to make sure that they have representation there in that process. Round two, as I said before, is members of the content committee, and then the final judges is an invitation only process. And this is where we pull in folks, journalists, from both within and outside traditional B2B journalism, so that we get that outside perspective that keeps the process honest. So is this something that you might want to get involved with? I would say yes. And there's a great clip out there from The West Wing where the President Bartlett says decisions are made by those who show up. And I think that that's very true on a lot of levels. The Neals ultimately matter because it's a peer-reviewed process. Neals are judged by you and by your peers. And I think it's important to have that range of voices and experience and perspective in order to keep the process fair and inclusive. And frankly, getting involved is probably one of the best things that you can do in order to help strengthen your own entries, because you're going to be exposed to a broad range of work that's outside of your regular niche and competitive set. I have learned more and gotten more ideas by participating in this process, and then build it into your shared learning routine with your staff. We definitely use it as an ideation lab. It's an opportunity to talk about topics and approaches and techniques that frankly we can steal and adapt for our brands, for our websites and our magazines. So not only does it inform your recognition of what the judges are looking for and what makes for a solid winning entry, but I think that the benefits of it for just your everyday work can be very valuable for you and your team. And then finally, I'll say that getting involved as a judge at any level presents opportunities for some pretty priceless networking. I've gotten a lot of great insight and advice and benchmarking conversations off of some of the friendships that I've made being involved in this process. And I think all of us, especially nowadays, with workloads being what they are and time constraints being what they are, we don't get out and get among our peers as much as I think any of us would like. And so the fact is, this is a process that really builds in the opportunity to be able to share to share insights, to share perspectives. And so I really cannot emphasize enough that this is something that is worth your time to engage with. So, okay, I'm sold. What's next? As I said, round one is a great way to get started and to dip your toe in. If you do decide that you want to get involved, what you should really just sort of expect is that this is a screening process that can be done remotely on your own schedule over roughly a 2-week period. You'll be prepared to review about 20 entries and score them. Like I said, it can be done completely on your own schedule. And if you want to get involved, just go ahead and click through to Neal Awards at SIIA.net and let Allison know that you want to get involved, and she will set you up. So David, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you in case there's any last-minute questions before we wrap up.
So I think we're exactly at 2 o'clock. So what we'll ask is that anybody who has any questions that you haven't already submitted, to please email those to us, and we'll respond to everything that's left over in a follow-up to the attendee group. And thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for your questions. You will see at the back of this deck that we've all provided our email addresses. So if you have any questions or you'd like any advice on the process, don't hesitate to reach out to us individually. And I think that's it. Thanks, everybody, very much. It is Thursday, but have great weekends nonetheless. And we hope to see you as judges sometime soon.